I let the plumber in at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning in late February. It was one of those Wellington summers that reminds you the city hasn't forgotten how to be brutal 40 degrees in the shade, the kind of heat that turns the harbor into a sheet of hammered tin and makes the old villas on the hill creak and groan like they're thinking about giving up. My name is Gerald Thorn. I'm 63 years old, retired from 30 years in the New Zealand fire service, and I thought I'd seen everything a house could throw at you. I was wrong. The leak had been going for about a week. A slow drip somewhere beneath the laundry floor. Nothing dramatic, just a persistent ticking sound at night that I kept telling myself I'd get to in the morning. My daughter Christine had been on at me about it. "Dad, you can't just ignore water damage," she'd said over the phone the previous Sunday. "It gets into the foundations." You know what Mum would have said. I did know. My wife Pauline had passed 2 years earlier, after a long illness, and she'd always been the one who kept the house in order. Without her, I'd been letting things slide more than I cared to admit. So I called a plumber, a young fellow named Jordan Mackey, mid-30s, cheerful, with a van that had a cartoon wrench on the side and the words, "No job too wet," written underneath it. He'd been recommended by my neighbor Ray, who said Jordan had sorted out his bathroom without gouging him on the price. I made 2 cups of tea, set one on the kitchen bench for Jordan, and went to read the morning paper on the deck while he worked. He was under the house for about 20 minutes. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text message from Jordan. I remember thinking it was odd. Why wouldn't he just call out to me? I was 10 meters away, but I picked up the phone and read it. "Mr. Thorn, there's something down here you need to see. Can you come to the side of the house? Don't call out." I set down the newspaper. I read the message again. The "don't call out" part sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. I'd spent 30 years in emergency services. I knew what it meant when someone told you to keep quiet. I walked around the side of the house slowly, the way you move when you're not sure what you're moving toward. Jordan was crouched at the access hatch, and when he saw me, he stood and spoke quietly. "There's a room under there," he said. Not the subfloor, an actual room. Built into the foundations on the southeast corner. I only found it because the leak's coming from a pipe that runs along the outside wall of it. He paused. "There are padlocks on the door, Mr. Thorn. 3 of them. And there's a smell." I looked at him. "What kind of smell?" He hesitated. "Gas. Not strong. But it's there." I crouched down and looked through the access hatch into the darkness. Jordan handed me his torch. The subfloor stretched away in the usual direction. Insulation. Timber joists. The occasional pipe, but at the far southeast corner, where the house met the slope of the hill, there was a wall that had no business being there. Rough timber framing, a door barely a meter tall, and 3 padlocks hanging in a steel hasp. My house was built in 1962. I'd owned it for 22 years. I had never known there was a room under it. I stood up and told Jordan to call 111. Then I stood very still in the 40-degree heat and tried to think clearly. Let me go back, because none of what happened that morning makes sense without understanding what the previous 3 years of my life had looked like. My son Owen had moved back to Wellington from Christchurch in 2021. He was 34 at the time, a carpenter by trade. Quiet and steady, the kind of young man who fixed things rather than talked about them. He'd been living down south with his partner, a woman named Brenda Walsh, and their little girl Rosie, who was 4 years old, and the best thing in any room she walked into. Owen had married Brenda in 2019. I hadn't warmed to her, and I'm not proud of how long it took me before I admitted to myself why. She was charming in public and cold in private. She managed Owen the way you manage a tool, picking him up when she needed something done and putting him down when she didn't. I'd watched my son become smaller over the years of that marriage. Quieter, more careful about what he said, and in front of whom. Her brother was a man named Scott Walsh, 15 years older than Brenda. heavyset, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been properly challenged. He worked in property buying and renovating houses, selling them on, occasionally renting them out when the market suited. He'd done well enough to own 3 properties in Wellington by the time I met him at Owen and Brenda's wedding. He gave a speech that was technically about Owen, but was actually about himself. I clapped with everyone else and didn't say what I thought. Scott had a habit of arriving unannounced. He'd turn up at Owen and Brenda's place with beer and a project, something that needed doing, something he'd just happened to be thinking about, something Owen's particular skills would be perfect for. Owen always said yes. Owen always said yes to everything Scott asked. In 2020, Scott bought a rundown property in Newtown and asked Owen to help with the renovation. Owen worked on it for 4 months, evenings and weekends, alongside his regular job. When I asked Owen how much Scott was paying him, Owen looked out the window and said, "We've got an arrangement." I should have pressed harder on that. In early 2021, Owen and Brenda separated. I never got the full story. Owen wouldn't talk about it, and Brenda had already rewritten events to suit herself by the time I heard anything. What I knew was that Owen arrived at my door on a Wednesday evening with a bag over his shoulder and a look on his face that I recognized from the first time he'd broken his arm at age 9. That particular look of trying very hard not to show how much something hurt. He stayed in my spare room. We didn't talk about Brenda much. We talked about Rosie constantly, what she'd said on the phone that week, what she was learning at kindy, whether she'd still remember her granddad's laugh if she didn't see him for a few months. The custody situation was complicated and becoming more so. Brenda had moved back to Christchurch with Rosie, and Scott had become, somehow, the one managing the communications. I didn't understand that at the time. I understand it now. Owen lived with me for 7 months. During that time, he was quiet. He worked hard. He rebuilt a stone wall in my garden that had been falling down since the 90s. Then, in September 2021, he told me Scott had offered him project management work on a new property development in the Hutt Valley. Accommodation included. A chance to get back on his feet. I told Owen to be careful. Owen told me Scott was family, or close enough. He moved out on a Saturday. I helped him carry boxes to his car. I watched him drive away down the hill. I called him the following Thursday, and he didn't answer. I called again the Sunday after that. Nothing. I drove to the address he'd given me in the Hutt Valley, a building site, half-framed, no one around. I called Scott's number and it rang out. I filed a missing persons report in October 2021. The police investigated. They found Owen's car parked at Wellington Airport, which suggested he'd left the country voluntarily. His passport had been used a flight to Melbourne, apparently, the week after he moved out of my house. The investigation wound down. The official position was that Owen had chosen to walk away from his life. I did not believe that, not for a single day of the 2 years and 5 months that followed. But I also didn't have anything to stand on except a father's instinct, which, as any police officer will tell you, is not evidence. Pauline died in June 2022. I don't think the grief killed her. She was already very sick. But I've always thought the not knowing about Owen was a weight she carried in her last months that she shouldn't have had to carry. We didn't talk about it near the end because there was nothing useful to say. But I knew she thought about him every day, the same way I did. After Pauline died, I stayed in the house. Christine offered to help me sell it and move somewhere smaller, but I couldn't. I told her it was sentiment. Really, it was that I kept thinking Owen might come back, that he might turn up at the door the same way he'd arrived in 2021, bag over his shoulder, trying not to show how much he was hurting. The house is on a slope. The rear section drops away sharply into a small garden, and the subfloor on the southeast corner is deep, nearly 2 meters of clearance where the foundations meet the hillside. I'd been under there perhaps twice in 22 years, once when we'd had a rat problem in 2008, Once, when the insulation needed replacing, I had never, not once, noticed the door. Jordan Mackey called 111 at 8:52 on that Tuesday morning. He was calm and clear. I heard him give the address, describe the smell, mention the padlocks. While we waited, I walked around to the back garden and looked at the southeast corner of the house from the outside. The foundation wall was old concrete block, covered in lichen and creeping fig that I'd never bothered to clear. In among the vegetation, barely visible, were the marks of newer work, recent concrete, slightly different in color, filling in what I now understood had been a window opening. Someone had sealed the ventilation. The police arrived in 9 minutes. 2 officers first, then a third. They were professional and thorough, and they asked me to wait in the front garden while they went under the house. I stood in the heat and looked at the harbor in the distance and felt something shifting deep in my chest. Not hope exactly, but the thing that lives just underneath hope. The thing that's almost too frightening to name. It took them 4 minutes to get through the padlocks. I heard one of the officers say something to the others in a low voice. Then the female officer came back up through the access hatch and walked toward me across the garden, and I knew from the way she was walking, careful and deliberate, like someone carrying something fragile, that what she had to tell me was going to change everything. "Mr. Thorn," she said, "there's a man in the room. He's alive. He's conscious. We're calling an ambulance now." I sat down on the garden path. Just sat down where I was standing. "Is it my son?" I said. She crouched beside me. "He hasn't told us his name yet, but we're going to take care of him." Some says, when some thousand sen. Owen was in Wellington hospital for 9 days. He was malnourished and dehydrated, with damage to his lungs from prolonged exposure to low-level carbon monoxide. A small gas fitting in the room had been leaking for what the doctors estimated was at least 3 weeks, slowly enough to be chronic rather than acute, enough to cause confusion and weakness, but not, by whatever mercy had been operating that morning, enough to kill him. He weighed 58 kilograms. He'd been 62 years younger than me and lean like his mother's side. But when I sat next to his hospital bed and held his hand that first afternoon, I could feel every bone in it. He didn't talk much for the first 3 days. When he did, it came in pieces, the way a story comes back to someone who's been lost inside it for too long. Scott had brought Owen to my house. That was the part that took me the longest to absorb. Not a property in the Hutt Valley. Not a building site. Here, my own house, which Scott had apparently been accessing via a key Owen had cut for emergencies and never thought to ask back for. During the months after Owen had moved out and before Pauline died, when the house had occasionally been empty for days at a time while I stayed at Christine's. Scott had discovered the subfloor room while doing work on my property. I still don't fully understand this part, but my best understanding is that he'd come to the house under some pretext, possibly related to a claim he'd been managing something for Pauline's estate, which turned out to be entirely fabricated, and had found the old utility room that the original builders had apparently used as a storage space, and which had been sealed up and forgotten decades before I bought the property. He had spent 3 months converting it. The motive, when it finally came out in court, was money. It is almost always money. Owen had worked unpaid on Scott's properties for 3 years, accumulating what Scott had framed as a financial arrangement, a share of future profits in lieu of wages. By Scott's own accounting, which the courts later found to be largely invented, this arrangement was worth nothing. By any honest accounting, Owen was owed somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000. When Owen separated from Brenda and began to push for proper payment, Scott had decided it was simpler to make Owen disappear. The passport, the flight to Melbourne. Scott had arranged all of it. A contact, a fake ID, a booking made in Owen's name using Owen's actual passport number obtained through Brenda. By the time the police looked, The digital trail pointed clearly to a man who had chosen to vanish. Except Owen had not chosen anything. Owen had gone to meet Scott in September 2021 to sign what he believed was a formal settlement of the wage arrangement. He'd woken up in the dark. He'd been under my house for nearly 2.5 years. I've sat with that fact many times since. My son was under my feet while I made breakfast, while I watered the garden, while I sat on the deck at night and thought about how quiet the house was. I slept 8 meters above him for 730 nights. There are no words for that. I've stopped trying to find them. Brenda Walsh knew. She had known from the beginning. The custody arrangement, the managed communications, the story about Owen leaving, she had helped construct all of it. Her reason was that she was frightened of Scott, and I believe that is partially true. But she had also received a payment. The court found that she had been paid $40,000 by Scott in October 2021, 1 month after Owen disappeared. She had used it to put a deposit on a house in Christchurch. She was convicted of being an accessory after the fact. She received 3 years, reduced to 18 months on a home detention order because of Rosie's age and her lack of prior convictions. I sat in that courtroom and heard the sentence, and I thought about the 9 days I'd spent in the hospital with my son, counting his ribs when he breathed. I didn't feel the 18 months was enough. I still don't. But I've learned, at 63, that the legal system is designed to manage competing considerations, and that justice and satisfaction are not always the same thing. Scott Walsh was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for kidnapping, false imprisonment, and fraud. His minimum non-parole period is 7.5 years. His 3 properties were seized under the Proceeds of Crime Act. His former associates in the property business have distanced themselves with remarkable speed, as people of that sort tend to do. Rosie is 6 now. She's living in Wellington with Christine and Christine's husband while Brenda serves her sentence. Rosie calls me Granddad, and she has Pauline's eyes and Owen's way of going very still and focused when she's thinking hard about something. She and Owen are slowly, carefully rebuilding what was taken from them. It is slow work. It requires patience. Some mornings it requires more patience than I have. Owen is still in therapy. He has good weeks and difficult ones. He's started doing carpentry again, small things, furniture, repairs for friends. His hands remember how to do it even when the rest of him is uncertain. I watch him work sometimes, and I think about the stone wall he rebuilt in my garden in those 7 months he lived with me before Scott took him, and how that wall has held for 3 years now without shifting. I've had the subfloor room demolished. A contractor came and broke it up properly, removed the framing and the sealed concrete, opened the foundations back to the outside. There's good airflow under the house now. Jordan Mackey fixed the leak while he was at it. He refused to send me a bill. I sent him one anyway, in the form of a bottle of Central Otago Pinot Noir and a card that said thank you for not looking the other way. Because that's the thing I keep coming back to. When I think about all of it, Jordan Mackey was a young plumber on a routine job on a hot Tuesday morning. He could have decided that the smell was nothing, that the door was old, that whatever was behind it was not his business and not his problem. He could have fixed the leak, sent me an invoice, and driven away. The cost to him of doing so would have been 0. Instead, he texted me quietly. He used the words "don't call out" because he'd understood, without being told, that if someone had been hidden in that room, it might not be safe to announce that they'd been found. He called the emergency services calmly and clearly. He stayed until the police arrived and gave a detailed statement. He did all of that not because it was required of him, but because it was right. I think about that when I hear people say that ordinary people can't make a difference, that these big, dark things happen, and there's nothing any individual can do. Jordan Mackey was 20 meters away from my son for 20 minutes on a Tuesday morning, and he paid attention, and he acted. That is the whole story. Everything else, the hospital, the court, the conviction, Rosie in Wellington, Owen's hands on the wood again. Everything else follows from 20 minutes of someone deciding to pay attention. We talk a lot in this country about community, about looking out for each other, about the kind of place New Zealand is supposed to be. I've lived here my whole life, and I believe in that, genuinely. But community isn't an abstraction. It isn't a value statement or a national identity. It's Jordan Mackey crouching in the dark under a stranger's house and noticing something that doesn't belong there and deciding that matters. It's a plumber who texts instead of calls, because something in him understood that quiet was safer. It's a father who doesn't stop believing, even when the evidence says to. If there is anyone reading this who has a person in their life who has disappeared, who has been told they left voluntarily, who has been written off as a runner, a ghost, someone who simply chose to go, please do not stop asking questions. The official story is not always the true story. Persistence is not madness. A father's instinct is not nothing. And if you are ever in a situation where something seems wrong, where a small detail doesn't fit, where a door has no business being there, say something. Text quietly if you need to. Call 111 when it's time. Don't decide it's not your problem before you've properly decided what the problem is. My son is alive because a plumber paid attention. That's worth saying as many times as it takes for it to mean something.